Hey, thanks, Brian. And my name is Michael Listman. I'm the education team lead for the Bureau for Latin America at USAID here in DC. It's a pleasure to see some of you and to know how many of you are on the line. We've got a great program lined up for you, and I'm going to ask Rebecca Rhodes to kick us right off, and I'm first going to introduce her. Rebecca Rhodes is Senior Advisor in USAID Center for Education and has ably guided the agency's early literacy program for nearly a decade. She's also instrumental in the conception of the LAC Reads project, which is what we'll be talking about today, and is comprised of several mechanisms and many, many partners, many of which are on the call, both presenting and attending today. Rebecca, please kick us off.
Thank you so much, Michael, and welcome to everyone. It's really a pleasure to be joining you today for this culminating event of the LAC Reads evaluation work. LAC Reads evaluation being one of the multiple LAC Reads programs that Michael just referenced. LAC Reads evaluation has invested nearly a decade of collaborative work on multiple multi-year evaluations of early literacy in the LAC region. Further, we want to extend a full slate of thank yous, obviously, to our partner Mathematica and Nancy Murray and her top-notch team of researchers on the LAC Reads evaluation work, at AIR and Juarez and Associates, all of our partners and implementing colleagues there, including those working on the other strand of LAC Reads capacity, the dozens of implementing partners and ministries of education and others who have collaborated with these evaluation efforts throughout the LAC region, and of course all my colleagues from USAID, particularly those from the LAC Bureau present here today, all protocol observed. What I'd like to speak about very briefly first is just the context for why we as the USAID team developed the LAC Reads evaluation concept as part of the broader LAC Reads portfolio and why we invested in it. And really the first reason may surprise you. The very first reason is that not all children in Latin America know how to read before the end of 2 to 3 years of school. We are a human community on the globe that can land astronauts on Mars, but we cannot ensure that every child learns how to read. And this is a preoccupation for development because reading is essential to development. It is, in fact, the number one from the early years of school that if you miss out on it will impact everything else about your life going forward. How do we know this, that not all children in Latin America know how to read? Among other sources, we know it from the Terce 2015 studies and reports, which had the following main findings. And I realize many on the call may be aware of these, but I'm going to go ahead and go through them as relates to the testing that Terce completed with 3rd graders and with 6th graders. So their summary states that many students in the region did not reach minimum learning levels. In the average Latin American country, almost 25% of 3rd graders and over 15% of 6th graders performed in the lowest levels of the reading test. Central America had a very large share of underperformers, with Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Panama having greater shares of underperformers than the average Latin American country. So when we read those two pieces of information, we realize that in Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Panama, there were more than 25% of 3rd graders and more than 15% of 6th graders who were underperformers. And I realize this is familiar territory for the specialists here. The Dominican Republic had the largest share of low performers in both the 3rd and the 6th grade, with more than 55% of 3rd graders and over 35% of the 6th graders performing in the lowest levels of reading on the Terce exam. This is not fair to the children of the region, and it's also not necessary. We know a great deal about teaching children how to read, and if we can evaluate how best to apply that in context, we can change these numbers. We also know that not every child in Latin America is learning how to read from USAID-funded program and evaluation work in the region. Excuse me. For example, a USAID-funded EGRA exercise in El Salvador found that a large minority of the 2nd graders did not have the mastery of all the sub-skills of reading. So in many ways, if we think about these data, we realize that the story of reading in Latin America is very inequitable. It's a story where some learn, some don't. Some make it through the process, some never do. And that can be equated to a sort of shaky foundation of these realities, and then to try to program to change them. The second reason we at USAID invested in this program is that we also don't actually know that much about the performance of students before grade 3. And yet in the world of reading instruction, we know that grade 3 is too late to first examine whether or not children are acquiring essential subskills of reading. We know that reading success or failure is determined much earlier, and that more attention needs to be paid to reading progress in the first 2 grades if results like the ones I just read out from the terce exam are to be improved. And the third reason we invested in LAC Reads evaluation is that it really isn't very easy to reform primary grade reading at any kind of scale. Success in reading relies on interconnected policy materials, training, coaching, assessment, and family engagement dynamics, which have to align with one another in equitable and inclusive ways if all children are to learn how to read. Adjusting and balancing these dynamics in a culturally and contextually appropriate way with one another requires significant technical expertise, yes, time, yes, and financial and material resources, yes, but it also requires strong research and evaluation. It's also not easy to reform reading because reading, like so many other education-related enterprises, is a domain in which ideology sometimes trumps evidence. The old adage that we all teach as we were taught is often still true, and as teachers we become attached to our ways of teaching and believe them to be the very best. This makes it challenging to shift classroom practice over time and really calls on researchers like those from LAC Reads evaluation to provide us with the information and the data that we can use to show teachers a new way of behaving in their classrooms. And then obviously another reason that reforming reading is so difficult is that the world is subject now to large-scale shocks and stressors that cross boundaries and genuinely ruin lives. COVID-19 comes to mind. COVID-19 has created serious delays and setbacks in reading progress in Latin America and worldwide, and these will slow the road to reading for many children of the region. Where will we turn to find information about what to do with that reality? We will turn to the types of research and evaluation that have been conducted under this program. So how has LAC Reads helped the children of the region and those of us who are committed to assisting them in their academic journey? The program has placed a strong focus on context-specific rigorous evidence, and the evidence built from the program focuses on reaching the hardest to serve and the most marginalized. So this evidence will be increasingly relevant as achievement gaps widen in the region due to COVID-19. And where possible, the program has also supported and given space and voice to researchers of the region so that we are trying to strike a new balance between Western paradigms informing and maybe even biasing the research we conduct and finding a way to bring in the culturally relevant and specific knowledge of those who are researchers in the countries where we work. So what can you listen for and learn about today? There is a silver lining to the stories I'm telling. This pandemic has further exposed the learning crisis that we already knew was present in LAC and given us a bittersweet opportunity to use this moment to plot our path forward. The pandemic has re-emphasized the need for available, usable, applicable evidence and created a unique opportunity for a regional approach to evaluation supported by technology. In this session, we hope you will listen hard and think about how the LAC Reads evaluations can be used moving forward, including thinking practically about their limitations, costs, and benefits, and asking challenging questions. In so doing, you, our wonderful, passionate audience, will establish a positive legacy for the impressive evaluation work of LAC Reads evaluation. Thank you very much. And now I'd like to introduce Nancy Murray, Project Director for the LAC Reads Evaluation Program and Director of the International Research Division at Mathematica.
Great. Thanks so much, Rebecca. Thanks for that great introduction. You're going to allow me to be able to skip over a couple of my early slides, or at least go lightly. So I'm so happy to be here today to talk about the work that we've been doing under the LAC Reads evaluation contract together with USAID. As Rebecca mentioned, the LAC education team is rightly concerned about the underserved populations who do not have the same access to education, may not speak the same language as the language of instruction, and whose access and ability to benefit from formal education programs may be hampered by violence or crime in their communities. We're really proud to be part of this LAC Reads community and the broader regional efforts to eliminate the gap for the most vulnerable and underserved. And I just want to say that we so appreciate the partnerships that helped us execute these evaluations, because we relied on the goodwill of program implementers, USAID missions, interest and support, ministries of education, and our local research partners in country, as you mentioned. I'd just like to share some of the things that we've learned along the way in this 8.5-year effort to generate evidence on what works for these populations that concern all of us. Next slide. So these are the points that I'd like to cover today. I believe that when you logged in, you may have seen some materials including this presentation, but also including brief summaries of the 4 impact evaluations that I'll be talking about today. But I'll take some time to give you a thumbnail sketch of each one of them and then talk about the findings across the portfolio of work that we've been doing, as well as some key conclusions and recommendations for you to consider. Next slide, please. Yeah, there we go. So our charge, our most important charge from USAID and the LAC education team was to generate rigorous evidence on promising practices to reach these vulnerable populations that we've been talking about. And we were specifically charged with using RCTs or randomized controlled trials. Next slide, please. So we used a variety of randomized controlled trial designs in the 4 countries in which we conducted evaluations, primarily 2-arm and 3-arm studies, and 2 of our evaluations used 2-arm study, where it just really looked at the program and compared it to either another program, which could be the Ministry of Education's prevailing practices, or no other program, as was the case in an after-school program that was stood up in Nicaragua, for example. The 3-arm studies we used in our 2-country evaluation of Leer Juntos, Aprender Juntos, and in Honduras, where we looked at the Educacion's programs, promising reading interventions. And the nice thing about the 3-arm study is it allows us to sort of take apart the program and look at some of its component parts, right? The ones that are hypothesized to be key drivers, perhaps, of improving reading in these populations. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Reading outcomes, we measured a range of reading outcomes. We used EGRA assessments in some places, and in some places we were lucky enough to have access to national standardized testing, which we also used. Next slide, please. So I've given you a hint about where the evidence comes from. I just wanted to say, before I launch into a brief description of the individual studies, that all these evaluations obviously had a strong quantitative element so that we could assess the program's impacts on reading skills. But we also included a qualitative component to better understand program implementation, as well as what was going on in the control group, right? What was the prevailing practice like, or what were the other programs that were active that we needed to understand to be able to understand what the results that our evaluations generated. Finally, in all the evaluations, with the exception of one, the Amazonia LAC evaluation in Peru, we collected cost data so that we would be able to assess the cost effectiveness of those interventions that proved to have impacts. Next slide, please. So our very first evaluation, which began many years ago, as the Leer Juntos evaluation, a two-country study. And it was implemented by Save the Children in a Quechua-speaking region of Apurimac in Peru, in the Andes, and the Quiche-speaking region of Guatemala. The program had two main components. The first was an in-school component, which consisted of teacher training and coaching. And the second component was a community action component, which consisted of volunteer-led activities in the community aimed at increasing the amount of time spent on reading outside of school hours. So the evaluation, as I mentioned, deployed a 3-arm randomized control trial design. And this was important because USAID was interested, and SAVE was interested, in assessing the relative contributions or the independent contributions of the in-school component and the community component. Next slide, please. Yes, our next study was Amazonia LAC, which I've mentioned. This program was implemented in the Amazon region of Peru, and two regions, Ucayali and San Martin, 2 departments, were included in the study. These departments were chosen because they lag behind national indicators in academic achievement, particularly reading. The evaluation focused on the impact of Amazonia LAC's in-school activities, also including teacher training and coaching, study groups, and culturally relevant materials to support instruction. This evaluation used a 2-arm design, and schools implementing Amazonia LAC's program were assigned to Group 1, and the interesting thing about this evaluation is that in the final design, in the groups, the comparison groups were different, the control groups were different. So in Ucayali, the comparison was to prevailing practice. So those schools received the Ministry of Education's sort of standard support to teachers and national pedagogical approach to the instruction in early grade reading. And the schools assigned to the control groups in San Martin received a flagship program that was being rolled out selectively by the Ministry of Education nationally that provided support to struggling learners in both reading and math. So interesting that we had actually 2 sets of research questions for that study, which we'll talk about more a little later. Next slide, please. Honduras. So in Honduras, we evaluated the Educación, Promising Reading Intervention. And this program focused on providing support to teachers and principals in the use of end-of-grade assessments and formative assessments to improve instruction. AIR and its local partners in Honduras implemented Educación, and for the purposes of the study, in 2 rural areas and 2 urban areas. The evaluation focused on the impact of the two specific intervention components. So again, we used a 3-arm design so that we could look at the effects of the entire package, so using end of grade assessments and formative assessments, and as well as the individual impacts of these interventions. Next slide, please. So the last evaluation I'll talk to you about is, it's called, the program is called Espacios para Crecer, and that was implemented on the Atlantic coast of Nicaragua, the second poorest region in Nicaragua, multilingual, multicultural, and the implementer was DevTech Systems. So Espacios para Crecer was part of a larger bilateral program that was implemented to address education and security issues in this region. But this piece of that project, particularly, was an intensive, they developed an intensive after-school program designed to support disadvantaged primary school-aged children by providing additional learning time to children identified as at risk. And the program was, as I mentioned, implemented on the Atlantic coast. It used a 2-arm design. Essentially, the treatment schools, or the treatment communities rather, received the program, and the control communities did not. So those kids received whatever they were receiving if they were going to school, and many of them weren't going to school. And the interesting thing, and one interesting feature about this evaluation, is we actually did random assignment at 2 levels. So for larger communities, we assigned participants to the treatment group at the child level. And for smaller communities, we assigned them at the community level. Next slide, please. Great. So now that I've given you just a tidbit of information on each of the programs we evaluated and some of the local context, I wanted to just share this sort of larger look across the portfolio so that at a glance you can appreciate a little bit of what we found, which essentially is that all of these programs had impacts. Now, not all the components had impacts, and not all the components had impacts in all the places where the programs were implemented. And we can talk about that if there's time. I put here too the range in effect sizes and the reading outcomes that we typically measured, and where the programs, were determined to have impact. I'm gonna I guess I just want to say one thing here. So for Leer Juntos, you can see, I don't think this is completely clear in the table. You can see that there were impacts in Peru, and that's for only the in-school component. And we didn't see an impact for the community component in either country. And in the case of Amazonia LE, right, we see impacts only in Ucayali, not in San Martin. And in Honduras, we see impacts for the combined package as well as for these separate elements, but we found it was very interesting that we found that the impacts for the end of grade assessment were larger in urban areas, and for formative assessments larger in rural areas. And in the case of Espacios para Crecer, the impacts were in small communities. I'm going to take you to the next slide really quickly so we have a chance to digest some of these learnings in a little bit more of a cross-cutting way. But just to address the cost effectiveness aspect of our work, as I mentioned, for 3 of the 4 evaluations, we were able to collect cost information. We were not able to do so for Amazonia LE, but I think it's interesting to look and see how the LAC Reads interventions focused on reaching the hardest to reach and these disadvantaged populations compare to similar programs in the region that were trying to affect student achievement. So I think we don't do too badly. We're sort of in the range, but along a continuum. And so we're seeing some clustering. The LAC Reads programs are the navy blue bars, right? And the published literature that we pulled just for LAC Reads are the light blue bars. So we're sort of clustering in the middle. And then LJAJ is a little bit, leer juntos, aprender juntos is a little bit more tilting towards the extensive, more expensive. And the EPC, we looked at cost effectiveness in two ways. So the more expensive estimate there is for the full budget. And the less expensive estimate is once the program is at steady state, not including sort of the training of local partners and startup and that sort of thing, that there's a lower cost effectiveness estimate. Take me to the next slide, please. Great. So Dave, how am I doing for time? Okay, so I'm just going to quickly go over these key conclusions, but just to emphasize, so all of these evaluations had important teacher training and coaching interventions, and they were proven effective amongst children in low resource contexts. Another reflection is not all of these programs were in a steady state when we started evaluating them, and perhaps even not when we ended the evaluations. So we weren't probably able to best represent the impacts of those programs, right? Because they were still learning and adapting. But the ones that are in a steady state, right, allow us to generate an impact estimate of full exposure, right, to a steady state program. So obviously that's desirable. Building capacity and understanding of evaluation design and its goals and the program implementation team paid huge dividends for us, which I'll talk about a little bit on the next slide. And the counterfactual matters. I'm just going to leave it at that and talk about it on the next slide as well. And we've already talked a little bit about the importance of looking at the impacts of these programs by key subgroups, whether that's region, whether it's by gender, whether it's by other aspects that were determined to be important when we designed the evaluation. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the bottom three bullets first, and then come back to the one on the top. So the bottom three bullets are more around what we learned about doing these evaluations well, and what in our minds makes this kind of an evaluation, an impact evaluation, successful, because they're difficult to do. And not everyone understands the goals, and not everyone understands random assignment and why we have to do it. But taking the time and working with our stakeholders to design these things, especially if we can start those conversations prior to the intervention rolling out, when the implementer is not crazy busy trying to do all they need to do to stand up the program, is really important if you can build that in to your thinking and future evaluations. It allows us to build a relationship, to take advantage of activities that are already planned for implementation, where we can explain to the sort of large cadre of staff that they've gathered and trained to support the intervention, things to look out for, right? So that they can help us protect the integrity of the evaluation design. And that actually happened in virtually every evaluation. Our implementing partner would flag to us spillover or contamination. In Honduras, the program implementers heard that formative and summative assessment forms were being slated to be delivered in just a few days to all of our control schools. They knew enough about the evaluation to understand that that would be a problem, right? And because we had these relationships with the Ministry of Education and with the team, we worked quickly to communicate to the Ministry of Education, and they stopped they stopped the distribution of those forms in the control schools because we were all committed to the evaluation and understood that this high stakes, right? And I think I'll just jump down to the bottom one, the bottom bullet, which is, I think, really important in our experience. So the ability, and Rebecca referred to it in her opening remarks, the fact that we were able to design multi-site and multi-contrast evaluations really allowed us to generate a lot of rich learning and make recommendations that were much more nuanced. And I think they also provide more confidence in the generalizability of our findings. So, for example, the fact that we found that the community component of Leer Juntos, Aprender Juntos didn't work in 2 countries is much more convincing than saying, well, it didn't work in Guatemala and the in-school component didn't work in Guatemala. And we would have said, Leer Juntos is, right, not having the desired impact. So in any case, the last thing I'll say, because I know I'm more than 5 minutes over here, is something that's not about how to do successful evaluations, but something for policymakers and program implementers perhaps to consider, which is that teacher training and coaching is such an important ingredient in all of these programs. And it's kind of expensive to do. So we should perhaps think about experimenting with some ways to successfully deliver some of these elements more efficiently, and we can bring down those cost effectiveness estimates for the more expensive programs, those hard to reach populations, so we can serve more. Thank you. I'm going to turn it back to Michael, and I'm sorry I took a few extra minutes of time. I hope we can make it up.
Thanks so much, Nancy. Give me a second to toggle here. So we're gonna gear up for the panel phase now, and I want to make sure, I know that our panelists are on. I want to make sure that each of them are getting the technical assistance they may need to refresh their browsers or make sure that they're patching correctly. So I'll trust that Brian and team are working with them while I tease this panel. So thanks again, Nancy and Rebecca. Thank you so much for your comments, and also just for being such fantastic and reliable thought leaders on this topic for such a long time. It's rare to have such strength in leadership and such continuity in that leadership on this issue. And I also want to take a moment to recognize Barbara Knox-Scythe, who's been our in-house thought leader for LAC on this topic for a long time, and has so ably managed the LAC Reads evaluation contract for so long. So thanks, Barbara, for all that you've done on this topic. And through the work that Nancy's just outlined, I think we can all agree that LAC Reads has generated some first-rate research and data on relevant early literacy challenges in the region, but it was also designed to go beyond simply generating documents, albeit documents of extremely high quality and relevance. The breadth and depth of the research and the ongoing work through the LAC Reads Capacity Program, which is an agreement with AIR, American Institute for Research, and Juarez and Associates, has closely collaborated with Mathematica over the years and was purposely designed to better understand how to use evidence to improve education across the region, the early literacy in particular, and to, as we've said, meet stakeholders where they're at in terms of providing technical support towards capacity building and using evidence for decision-making in this space. So that also means better understanding the research findings around what works and why, but it also means diving into the important practical implications, sometimes political implications, as was mentioned earlier, of this research to empower the stakeholders in the region and the education community. Moving forward under increasingly difficult circumstances, of course, the past year as an example, and I would argue an increased reliance upon and sadly scarcity of solid solid information. So to help us parse through these objectives and to discuss the state of evidence use in literacy improvement in the region, I'm very pleased to be joined today by 4 panelists that have been living and breathing this work and who each bring a unique perspective to how we can use what we've learned from LAC Reads writ large to inform improvements in how all of us approach this work. Let me take a second to introduce these outstanding panelists. Juan Luis Cordova is the Regional Director of the LAC Reads Capacity Program at Barnes and Associates, where he works to engage stakeholders across the entire region on early literacy improvement. Eric Aversman is the Senior Director for Education at Save the Children and oversaw the implementation of the Leer Juntos, Aprender Juntos program in Guatemala and Peru. Mariela Isabel Celada Ochoa is the Dean of Education at Universidad del Valle de Guatemala and is the Director of Red Ley, a regional research and learning community dedicated to early literacy. And finally, Ansel Checker Mendoza is the Director of Evaluation of Educational Quality for the Ministry of Education in the Dominican Republic, where she applies her expertise on early literacy to use data and evidence to inform education policy. And I will add, one of the 3 most trusted names on early literacy information based on my own recently completed key stakeholder interviews so you know what she says is going to be reliable. I'll be posing some questions to the panelists first, and then I'll move to Q&A from the chat box on the platform here as they come in. Be patient with me. I'll try my best to make sure I can get them all represented. To ask a question, please use the Q&A function below. And you can ask questions, I'm sure you have a lot, about the evaluations that Nancy just reviewed. And Nancy and team may be able to cover those or other factual questions directly in the chat rather than for consumption in the panel. However, I do want to note that we are going to be conducting a separate event in the very near future where we focus specifically on those evaluations, their methodologies, their findings and conclusions. So if you want to wonk out with Nancy and the Mathematica team, keep an eye out for that upcoming discussion. So I do have a set of questions that I'd like to pose to the panelists specifically to get the ball rolling here. And I'm assuming that we are now patched in with each of them. And so my first question is for Juan Luis. And Juan Luis, can I just get a verbal confirmation that we've got you online?
I am here. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, my friend. So the first question for you, Juan Luis, is many of the findings that Nancy just shared focused on the importance of both implementing organizations and evaluators, engaging with stakeholders early and often. From your perspective on the LAC Reads Capacity Program, what does effective engagement, especially on the uptake side of things, look like to you?
So thank you, Michael, for having me. So to change current practice by embedding evidence-based programming into local structures is, as you mentioned before, the cornerstone of the LAC Reads Capacity Program. As such, sustainable uptake only happens when you strengthen local capacities by responding to local needs and demands and adjusting interventions to context-specific dynamics. I would like to respond to the how in 2 sections. One is with the areas that are mostly under our control, and secondly, with the challenges at the more of a broader level. In the experience of our own work in the region, capacity building needs certain elements, and here are some that I would like to highlight. The first one would be on-the-ground presence with a local team with management decision capabilities. Secondly, I would mention a thorough knowledge of who the key stakeholders are in the sector and what is their influence and interest in the area. What are their incentives for uptake evidence, and what are the gaps in terms of evidence and programming? The third element is the relevant research that responds to specific contexts and demands. and the use of that evidence in effective translation to context-specific demands in the region. Finally, I will mention that it is also important to have linkages to regional networks to leverage resources, increase participation, and have a common approach to evidence uptake. Now, producing change in local capacities in key stakeholders in the region is not an easy task. This is supported by research on evidence utilization, as Rebecca mentioned at the early stages of our program. The Central American region does have some institutional capacities and resources to support capacity building interventions. However, long-term efforts with a focus on responding to demands are very limited. And without a coordinated approach with long-term efforts intended to have an impact there at that level is simply not realistic. The second thing that I would like to mention is that incentives for evidence uptake vary considerably according to countries and categories of stakeholders. These are very difficult to manage from a standalone intervention. On another topic, more from the epistemological perspective, is that interventions to strengthen capacities need to take into consideration program participants' knowledge structures. That should be the starting point from every intervention trying to build up capacities at local levels. Rebecca mentioned it also. A wide range, for example, a wide range of teaching to read materials have a strong presence in the region for decades now with outdated evidence and ineffective instructional methods. Cognitive biases from participants exposed to these tools have a tremendous force that pulls the actor into tradition and comfort zones, hence the importance of a long-term process with enough follow-up. And finally, I think it's important to stress the relevance of evidence dissemination and promotion of best practices in the public debate arena, something that the region is not used to and is needed to continue to place evidence-based programming in early literacy or other sector in the education field at the helm. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks so much, Juan Luis. Next, I wanna ask Mariela, and if I can, just get Mariela verbal confirmation that we've got your audio okay.
Yes, Michael, I'm here.
Hello. So Mariela, academic institutions like Universidad del Valle across the region have taken on an important role in both building the capacity for generating evidence in early literacy, but also in helping to shape how emerging research gets translated into new evidence-informed practices with key stakeholders like ministries and others. What are some of your takeaways from the LAC Reads evaluations, and how does or will RedLay, which you also direct through Universidad del Valle, incorporate these evaluations and findings into their approach to evidence sharing in the region?
Okay, thanks, Michael, for the question. I want to say that Relay is a young network, but it's also a unique kind of network focused on early literacy that in this formation is working with 6 universities by Central America region and Dominican Republic. So all of these universities has a strong commitment related with doing high quality research and also contributing to share and utilize it to inform evidence-based research. Also, there is important how we link this evidence to better practice for teachers at classroom. And also it's important to highlight how LAC Reads efforts are contributing to build capacities regarding to research and the formation of new generation of young research at Relay universities. Also, Relay has an important research regional agenda, a focus on early literacy, and also, this focus as well in the challenge of early literacy on the region. That is going through how we can improve in produce this kind of evidence helpful for the region and produced by the region. And also how this agenda is linked both to our master program that is forming the next generation of researchers, but also how we can foster this agenda in our research scholarships. So that's a new way to improve and to produce and share all the research that is produced. And also for university, it's really important how we can link in a more direct way and a specific way the teaching, research, and the practice. So this is a very direct a way to do that. So I think that's a very important legacy on the LAC Read program's inputs and results that Relay can learn and put in practice. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mariela. And I'll note for folks that are hearing about, hopefully not, but for folks that are hearing about Relay for the first time, this is the Central American network on early literacy research that LAC Reads capacity and LAC Reads evaluation have been working with for a number of years now, and I think really represents one of the key goals of the LAC Reads initiative in the first place, which was to empower people from Central America and the Caribbean in particular, where we focus our efforts, to produce relevant, usable information for Central Americans and the Caribbean by Central Americans and Caribeños. So thanks, Mariela. We'll come back to you and we'll learn a little more about Relay. I want to move over to Eric, who I think is patched in.
I'm here.
And Eric, thanks, Eric. It's great to see you again. And Eric, you are in a unique position on this panel. You helped oversee, along with others, including Katie Anisu, I think is on the call, some time ago, helped oversee one of the programs that was evaluated that Nancy mentioned, which showed mixed results. Literacy Boost, which is the literacy intervention model that Leer Juntos was based upon, was also evaluated in other parts of the world, and with some noted successes, important successes. They also showed the difficulty of, as we sometimes say, moving the needle. That is, seeing reading scores move in significant ways. So what has your experience with impact evaluations on Literacy Boost through this and in other cases, because you've seen it happen numerous times now? And what's your experience with literacy improvement in general? What has it taught you about the practicalities of evidence-based program design and implementation? A hard question, but I know you have a lot to say on this topic.
Yeah, and it's a big question, and I think I'll try to speak as much as I can specifically to the experience of the Leer Juntos project that was evaluated here. And as you said, it was the results in some way were disappointing, but they were extremely useful to us, and they were in some ways essential because we had a program that needed this kind of evaluation. And we had some very promising results from other places in the world, as you noted. But this kind of three-armed study was something that we hadn't had the opportunity to undertake. And so this was a real opportunity for us. I want to speak specifically to the community side, because I think that that's where some of our, this prompted some of the greatest learning that we've had internally. And that's because it didn't show effects. And the reason we were doing a community piece is because there is a pretty substantial piece or body of literature, largely from the global north and from the United States, about the importance of home literacy environment. And also we know from USAID's own studies on opportunity to learn, children aren't getting great, in many of these countries, aren't getting a great opportunity to learn through school. And so it seems to make sense if you put those pieces together that the home literacy environment is important. And particularly important if there's a limited opportunity to learn through the former school system, that a complementary intervention on the home and community side makes a lot of sense. The fact is we didn't see that through it, and it did prompt Save the Children to take a hard look at the work we were doing. And I would just say with an impact evaluation like this, you should never kind of see it in terms of a thumbs up or a thumbs down binary kind of way, right? There's a lot of information to digest, and you have to be careful about what it is that you're seeking to learn from. So, I don't think we ever saw the study as, should we be doing work with communities and families or not? I don't think the takeaway from this was stop doing work with communities and families. But as I think you alluded to, we need to look at it maybe from a different perspective, take a step back and say, okay, what are the big questions around how we, can we impact home literacy environment, home learning environment, and what are the most effective ways to do that? And, certainly we have, and as a result, I think we're much better positioned today to cope with the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic school shutdowns than we would have been without this kind of study, because now there's millions more of children for whom their home literacy environment is so much more important than it was 12 months ago. And I feel like we're in a much better place to address that type of learning because of this, the experience of having gone through this program. Just a couple things about, participating in an RCT. While impact evaluations are essential, the gold standard RCTs do present a host of challenges that really need to be seriously considered. And as Nancy mentioned, our evaluation is one of the ones where the MOE's prevailing practices were the counterfactual, and that was a real challenge. Because it meant that we couldn't really work with the ministry during the time of implementation. We had a lot of information coming in, we had a lot of learning. We knew our ministry counterparts were eager to know what was going on and how it was going, and from that perspective of not corrupting the design, we really had to hold off on a lot of that information until it was very near the end of the project. Also, as Nancy mentioned, this was a project that was really just getting up and running, and it was not a steady state activity. And there were a lot of costs we were investing in the kind of the startup and launch of it. And it was sort of doubly difficult because Mathematica then also had reams of data they were trying to process, and they were not as a criticism, but the reality was it was very slow for Save the Children to get that information and to make any adjustments to the programming as we were going on. And this was, as a program that was just starting up, we would want to normally be in a process of adaptive management and learning from our work, what we were seeing as we were going on. And just as an example, we got the midterm evaluation results around the time that the project was closing. So thinking about that phase of programming, the availability of data, and maintaining that kind of fidelity and integrity that you need to do an RCT right. These are things that I know everybody's aware of, but I do think it bears repeating that it's really important to have these in mind and to make sure that the compromises that you're going to have to make, with the adopting an RCT approach, balance out the advantages, or hopefully don't exceed the advantages of what you want to gain by venturing into it in the start. But overall, just to come back to my opening point, it was a great experience for Save the Children to participate in this, and it really did drive learning within our organization and the way that we work with partners around the world on home and community-based reading programs now.
Excellent. Thanks, Eric. And I really do want to emphasize that we really do appreciate your unique perspective and your your openness and transparency to working on this type of thing when you're obviously vested in rolling out a program that your main priority, of course, is to impact the lives of children you're hoping to serve, and at the same time you're committed to sort of saying here's exactly what we're doing down to the costs and administrative practices to better understand how effective the work is. So we really do appreciate that. Now I want to move over to Ansel. And as you know, Ansel is an experienced researcher as well, and she did her doctoral studies actually on early literacy, and is now firmly embedded within government as the head of evaluation and assessment in the Dominican Republic. So Ansel, you have an expertise in evaluation and also the proverbial seat at the table in policy formulation. So the question we want to pose to you is, how can robust emerging evidence, like we're discussing today, help shape the Dominican Republic's approach to improving early literacy, especially when, as our panelists have discussed, especially when it reveals no silver bullets?
Yes, thank you, Michael, and thank you all. Yes, we have in the region and Dominican Republic low results. I mean, many kids not learning to read. And I think that to have evidence-based programs, to have this evidence research, really help to develop policies that could really target that problem. And this is very important because I think it was mentioned, sometimes we have programs based on good intentions, we have and no real data, and sometimes we have a debate based on ideology and beliefs. And I think that to have evidence can really allow for us to have a better discussion, and also to have more ideas to implement and develop policies that can really help children to learn. And not only policies, but also to focus on the schools and the teachers, because the change occurs in the classroom. So I think that is a contribution of LAC Reads, and to have all this body of evidence, and also to keep producing more research, because as we see, context matters. So we need to really do the evaluation and really assess what worked in our context. And I think, like Eric said, not only do that evaluation at the end, but during the process, so we can get information and make the adjustments needed just to help improve the outcomes. Thank you.
Thanks, Ansel. So we're going to ask, we are going to get to the Q&A, which I am monitoring. We have a couple of more cross-cutting questions that we'd like to pose that'll give our panelists a chance to expound a bit on some of their points and some of the more nuanced aspects of what they're discussing. So some of the LAC Reads evaluations that Nancy's discussed have shown that there are facets of what works in one context that might not work in another, might not be generalizable, which makes it even more important to better understand the communities we aim to serve. So a question for Eric to start. Briefly, what advice would you give about who to engage, when, and how when designing donor-funded interventions in literacy? And I should note that donor-funded interventions in literacy are their own particular beast. They're not necessarily the same thing as government-funded interventions. But thinking about that, what advice would you give, especially when working with vulnerable and hard-to-reach populations that we tend to prioritize?
Yeah, so it's important to understand, I think, in this question, the communities that we aim to serve, but also structuring the evaluation so that we can understand how the interventions are working for different subgroups in the communities that we're serving. And this question of what works for whom is, I think, probably the most important one in front of our sector as we work to SDG 4. And so, an example from the evaluation that Save the Children did in Guatemala itself, in the same geographic region as the LAC Reads was working in around the same time, we did an EGRA-like reading assessment and did an equity analysis and found that the single biggest determinant of learning was the concentration of either low or high SES students in an individual school. And that was held at baseline, and it also held at end line, so that we saw that our intervention was really benefiting those who were already advantaged in one way or another. And this held over language of instruction or gender. So this was the biggest piece. And so what I think you see from looking at it from that way, there are underlying inequalities, and our work was largely serving to reinforce these inequalities. But once we knew that, you had a very different project and a set of questions and impacts that you're trying to achieve. And in this case, it's looking with the Ministry of Education at a local level at these different profiles of schools and how we might tailor the interventions to those schools and profiles. And so, I think that the advice about it, like who to engage when and how, you really have to have this kind of nuanced understanding of what you're trying to achieve. And I think underlying almost everything we try to do, sure, there's the global aspiration of improving reading, but it really is for particular populations, and understanding who those populations are and what the particular needs they have are then leads you to get a better understanding of who to engage when and how.
Thank you. As Rebecca Rhodes will remind us, teaching to read really is rocket science, and she can prove it to you. I want to ask the same question to Juan Luis. Juan Luis, you've been on all sides of this angle. You've been a staff at USAID. You've been involved in program implementation. You've been involved in program evaluation, and most recently, you've been involved in advocacy and technical assistance. So what advice would you give, having worn all those hats?
Well, I think there are several issues that we can use as lessons learned. The first one that I would mention is that interventions need to be cost effective for uptake and sustainable approaches. Sometimes these methodologies are pieces of interventions. You were mentioning donor interventions, so sometimes cost-effective methodologies refer to just pieces of previous interventions, not the entire package. So that's one thing. The other thing is probably I would elaborate on the effective translation of evidence into practice that I was mentioning before. We know that knowledge products as a standalone intervention would not lead to change or systemic change, and that needs to happen with a strong accompaniment and coaching system along the way, without just the intervention to trying to disseminate evidence and embed a given product in participants would not lead to capacity building. And the other thing that I would think is useful to stress here is that these kinds of interventions need to be embedded through local structures and work through sometimes local authorities. These can take some time at the beginning of a given intervention, but it will build sustainable approaches and empowerment from the other side of the equation, which is what is left after the intervention.
I appreciate that Juan Luis. Let me switch it up and ask to Ansel and then to Mariela. But first to Ansel, from your vantage point, one of the persistent challenges that we've seen and heard with putting evidence into practice at scale is that evaluation cycles and policy cycles rarely line up. And when they do, there are other barriers to true uptake. What does that mean for the path forward in using evidence to improve literacy in the LAC region? And what, perhaps, let me add on to that question, what would you like the donor community and practitioners to know about the logistics of this dynamic from the ministry side of things? Oh, I may have scared Ansel off. That was a tough question. I don't know, Ansel, do we still have you on?
Yes, sorry, was my.
Okay.
It's challenging, but I was saying that there is a tension between the evaluation cycle and the policy cycle that are not lined up, as you said. And it's because you have the policymaker that needs to act right away. It has a limited time to do that. But we all know that education change takes time. And we also know that evaluation needs to follow a rigorous process. And I will add in the region that there is, for some policymakers, they do not really like the randomized trial design because they have to decide that a part that will be a control group and then a treatment group that would not receive the program. And that is sometimes hard to communicate and understand. So what I think that the evaluation experts need to do is better explain to policymakers the importance of this design, the importance of a good assessments, to have valid conclusions, and that would allow to have to make more effective decisions in the long run. But it's difficult to scale up after a pilot because sometimes you left out things that were very important. And I think that we have to pay attention to the implementation process. That's why it is important to have the evaluation from the beginning, design and the monitoring too, not to wait to the end, but really to give insights and information to the community, to the policymakers, to understand the importance of evaluation, but also to give information so that they can make adjustment and they can identify factors that probably are hindering or affecting the implementation of the program. So it's not something that we can solve, like you said. It's not. There's no a recipe there, but I think we need to address those different needs and really come up with innovation and with practical recommendations. Also with cautious, because as we all said before, we need to consider always the context and all the multiple factors involved. No.
Thanks, Ansel. I appreciate that. And then a quick follow-up to Mariela. From your angle, sitting in an academic institution and coordinating numerous academic institutions across Central America, the Caribbean, through Relay on this particular topic, what do you see as the role for researchers in helping to better align evaluation cycles with the realities of policymaking? What are the challenges that researchers face in that, and what kind of opportunities do they have to switch gears?
Okay, I agree with Ansel that there is a challenge in order to align the timeframes from evaluation and policymaker. So I think researchers can play a fundamental role related with how they help us to translate the evidence that they are producing in a more diverse way to get this evidence reach out different audience. also there is an opportunity to learn how is the better way to communicate it, because we need to ensure that policymakers, academics, and other audience are understanding this evidence. So I think we have here a huge opportunity to make some alliances with some communication experts. Also, how we show this evidence to other people in that kind of formats, and how we can make more accessible this evidence that the researchers are producing to inform the public policy and inform the policymakers, and give them some information that is useful and give them insights and input to inform their decisions that they are taking. I think that we can foster a more frequently dialogue between researchers, policymakers, and people who works with communication in order to doing this process more accessible and also more frequently related with projects and interventions.
All right, I appreciate that. So we have about 15, almost 20 minutes left, and I'm going to start looking at some of the Q&A coming in, and we really appreciate that. Feel free to keep those questions coming in for the panel. I will note that a number of questions that we've received here are specific to Nancy and or particular aspects of the evaluation she discussed. Those are great questions. I will try to get that over to Nancy towards the end, but I will also note, just to quell concerns, that we're going to be taking down a transcript of all the questions, and any questions at all that are left unanswered, we will make sure that we take it upon ourselves to get answers back and share that with the audience. So we'll get those to you. And also, Nancy reminds me that there's in the actual briefs and then the longer reports of each of the evaluations, a lot of the technical questions will be answered. Doesn't mean you'll have the chance or bandwidth to read all those, but they are there. So there's a question that I like because it's very general, and I'm going to pose it to each of the panelists. I will do kind of as quick of a take on this as we can. And that is, to start us off, what is the biggest lesson that can be drawn from LAC Reads about how to make research more timely and relevant and actionable? And I will add for measurable literacy improvement. What's the biggest lesson? What's your big takeaway? And let me start off. Let me start off with Juan Luis.
Thank you, Michael. So, as you know, the landscape has changed considerably during the last year or so, and there have been some restrictions on how we get that information, how we get that evidence. Some of the things that we have been quite successfully in doing and trying to promote is just having some kind of a strong network of key stakeholders that will allow you to get a sense of what's going on in the ground, especially in these times in which there are several restrictions to obtain information from the ground. So, for example, one thing that we did in the LAC Reads capacity program is, given that we had those restrictions, was to tap into our networks in the region to get a sense of what were the opportunities and challenges that COVID presented. So we did a perception study on that. So I think that, that gave us a lot of information for programming that we were able to feed into our programs, and also for other donors and governments alike. So one of the biggest lessons that we have is just to continue to have strong linkages to regional networks of key stakeholders that implement programs as these are important for policy making decisions.
Thank you. Can I switch it over to Mariela? You've seen a lot of research over the past several years. What are and you've been monitoring this topic for a long time. What are some of the takeaways? What are some of the big lessons learned for you on all this?
Okay, I want to say that this COVID-19 era give us an opportunity to translate and to use this evidence-based research and how we can translate it into best practice resources and, for example, how we can help teachers to giving them tools to working on emergency remote teaching, helping children to learn to read. Also, I dare to say that universities has a big opportunity in fostering this kind of research and link this research with evaluation of these teacher training programs and using all these insights and inputs from the evidence to improve their teacher training programs. So for me, there is a huge opportunity in these efforts for LAC Reads.
And Eric, you a little bit already answered this question, but maybe you can give it a shot, and or you can also say perhaps what some of the more surprising or useful findings, takeaways from the research that you engage with were.
Yeah, I think I did. I would just echo what Juan Luis said and then come back again to that point about the challenge of having the government as the counterfactual. I think having the government as the partner and having it be their programs, first and foremost, that are being implemented or that are being evaluated is essential. And I think that that's probably the best way to get to that question you asked around like quick turnaround in action and uptake of findings.
Yeah, and then for Ansel, what would you say your key takeaway from the degree to which you've been engaged on this? What are some of the key takeaways and lessons learned for you?
I think that LAC Reads have given a great contribution to the region, especially through this research, this robust research that shows evidence of the programs, and especially because of the transparency in the findings. You're being able to say this works, this does not work. There are mixed evidence. This we don't know. So it is, and I think that is a great contribution to make research, to produce research in the region, in Central America, Dominican Republic. So we have that reference to really made the findings in an actionable way, like to put it in a simple format. I think that we can always improve in that, with to communicate with policymakers and teachers and schools. But I think that it was a great contribution, and we need to share the experiences with others and to share the ideas, and especially those specific lessons that each program learned, so we can all improve together.
So the next question that's come in that is a little bit cheeky, but I really like it. I'm going to pose it to the panel first, but Nancy, if you want to address this too, feel free. And the question is simply, did your work do more than just measure the gap that everyone already knew existed? Juan Luis, do you want to start?
Sure.
Before I totally throw you under the bus with that, let me interpret that question a little bit as, we know there's a problem. We know that children are not learning to read at the levels we want. What's the role of evidence and evaluations in this dynamic in terms of actually making a difference? How does this stack up against the challenge that we know exists?
Thank you, Michael. So that's a very simple question, but a very complex one at the same time. I would say that we knew from the beginning and from the early stages of this program, having the information from Mathematica on hand, that and you know the evaluations mentioned by Rebecca and regionally, that there's a problem, and there's a serious learning crisis in the region, especially I would say in the countries in which we work, and it was exacerbated by COVID to levels that we just don't clearly understand yet, where in areas we have anecdotally 50% of students that dropped out last year. So it's a complex environment. Within that environment, I think the one thing that we learned is that you just can't put out knowledge products and expect that those will be uptaken miraculously. The issue that was mentioned by Eric on local buy-in and working through local structures is a powerful one. And usually we do expect some kind of work locally just with the government. And in our experience, the stakeholders that do influence learning go much beyond just government-related entities. So you're talking about universities, large universities with strong training programs, civil society investing resources with local innovations. You have private foundations that are doing probably interesting work, but it's not that well systematized, and grassroots organizations that are usually not picked up by any kind of monitoring system. So just putting attention to those local actors and working through those makes a difference in terms of creating demand for quality services and trying to move the needle, as you mentioned. I will leave it at that.
Thanks, Juan Luis. Another question I'm going to pose, and then I'll just, in the interest of time, I'll just pick a panelist to answer that. The question is, how do we look to the future of literacy, which is the title of our panel, of course, in light of impact in the education system during COVID? As we start the 2021 school year, we need quick tools to assess the impact of 2020 and student learning to do remedial work in early 2021 to mitigate the gap in reading. So let me actually hand that question to Ansel, who I know is spending much of her days these days trying to answer that very question. Ansel?
Well, that is a huge challenge that we have because of COVID. Most of our schools were closed, and we did not get the chance to assess. So we really do not have information of how much this COVID impact the students' learning, even though we know that it did, that it does. And we don't know if what we are putting in place, this distance education, if this is mitigating the COVID effects. We don't have that information because we haven't been able to collect data to assess. And I think that's a challenge that we all have because I think we cannot wait longer. We need information to make decisions. We need information to see if what we are doing is having any effect. And I think that this year we're planning to do that, of course, with a lot of challenges and restrictions because of the protocols, because students are not at home. So I think that we probably need to do a panel another one, to really get together and think about new methodologies, new ideas, new ways to collect the data and new and maybe very practical or less or not expensive ways to really assess students. Because right now we have a lot of uncertainty. And I know that we have learned from this research, evidence-based research, and we can really build from that, but we have a different scenario now. So we really need to figure out how we're going to collect valuable information that could really help us to develop other policies and programs now.
I appreciate that, Ansel. I know you guys are working hard on that, and I know there are no easy answers. We only have a few minutes left, and in that time, and before I close out, I'm going to ask Nancy to unmute herself because a lot of questions have come in. I know she's been monitoring some of those with respect to her presentation. So I just wanted to give her a couple of minutes before I close to try her best to do a quick round robin of answering some of those. So Nancy, take it away.
Sure. Thanks, Michael. I'm not sure that I have captured them all, but I did definitely want to provide responses to a couple of them. And I also wanted to remind folks that if you take a look at the briefs, they provide a link to the full reports in those cases where the full reports are on the deck. And if the full report's not on the deck yet, you can still get the design and the interim studies, which will answer a lot of your technical questions around the kinds of analyses we did specific to each evaluation. That's all laid out ex ante in the design report and in subsequent reports leading up to the final report. So sorry I can't sort of answer every question, but those are great resources. But I will also follow up by email with those folks for whom we have contact information and answer specific questions. I wanted to go to 2 or 3 questions that I think are actually really important. So Fernando Rubio asked, hi Fernando, hope you're doing well, asked whether we would have gotten different results if we had used a longitudinal approach to the evaluations rather than a cross-sectional. So I wanted to just actually say I didn't get a chance to get into a lot of the details, obviously, of the studies in this very short presentation, but we in fact did follow children over time in each of the evaluations. So we did use a longitudinal approach. I think we would have gotten a very different approach had we used a cross-sectional, approach to measuring impacts. So I feel that we're much more confident in our results because we used a longitudinal approach. And then we looked across both groups of children for whom we had baseline information and follow-up information. And we were able to assess the difference across the groups that way. That was our approach in all the evaluations. I wanted to just go back to one of the questions that you read, Michael, and posed to the panelists, because I'm not sure if I interpreted that question correctly, but I think that the question implied that we were just measuring the gaps or the deficits in student learning through these evaluations that we did. And that I don't think of that as the purpose of these evaluations. I think the purpose of these this portfolio of work was to contribute evidence on whether or not these promising programs are actually generating the kinds of results or impacts, right, that we should put in front of policymakers and donors, right, and at a price point that they can afford. And so I guess if I were a Ministry of Education, if I were a minister in the Ministry of Education, if I were a decision maker in the Department of Finance, I would want to know those things, right? And certainly if I were a donor, I would want to know, are my investments resulting in the desired outcomes? And right, and other program implementers would want to know that too, right? What are these programs? What are the best practices in these programs that are going to help me help the most kids, right, as quickly and in as a meaningful a way as possible. So I just wanted to chime in on that one. Sorry, I know you didn't ask me. Finally, there's one other question where one of the audience members asked for us to translate the effect sizes into the actual more traditional metrics of the reading measures. And I did want to just say in the briefs and in the reports, we report out both the traditional fluency measures, comprehension, decoding in the metrics that you would be accustomed to. So we have them in both expressions. Sorry, I couldn't answer all the questions, but I'm happy to follow up outside of this meeting.
I really appreciate those follow-ups. I really appreciate those follow-ups, Nancy, and also for answering the question about the gaps. That's an important clarification that you made. And it's also effectively the spirit of what we're trying to do through LAC Reads. So thank you for adding that. So I am going to try to close up. I know we're at time. Anyone that has to hop off, we understand. But in closing, I want to note that Nancy's presentation, as well as the briefs that she mentioned, are available to download in the resources tab below, and also on the Mathematica LAC Reads page. A recording of today's event will be available shortly, and if you signed up for the event online, we will send around that recording, as well as the LAC Reads reports and resources mentioned today. We'll also do our best to answer some of the unanswered questions and distribute them through that channel. And also, just a quick note, reach out to us and the panelists. If nothing else, I think that this event is simply a chance to open up the conversation on the research, on USAID's approach to literacy improvement, and to better understand how we can all work together to appropriately leverage information and address the ongoing literacy challenge that we know is there across the region. Nancy's contact information is included in the slide deck. I know she'll be happy to answer research-specific questions or connect you to others that were involved in today's discussion. And again, keep an eye out for an upcoming event where we can really dig in to some of that great work. And just to close, a huge thanks to Rebecca, to Nancy, to Juan Luis, Mariela, Ansel, and Eric for agreeing to participate and share their perspectives. We couldn't have asked for a better and more interesting panel. Thanks again to everybody that's participated, and we hope you've enjoyed this. Look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you.